Alright, this presentation is for Chapter 16, Section 4, pages 397 to 401. As you can see, it will be about the election of 1860 and how the results of that election led to the secession of the Southern states. There were 4 candidates for the 1860 election. The Southern Democrats nominated John Breckinridge. The Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas. As you can see, the Democratic Party was split in half because of the slavery issue. Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln, and a new party arose at this time called the Constitutional Union Party, and they nominated John Bell. This is a political cartoon from that time. You can see the 4 candidates. Starting with the left, that's Abraham Lincoln, followed by Stephen Douglas, then Breckinridge, and then Bell standing on the chair. And as you can see, this symbolizes the idea that the country is being torn apart because of the slavery issue, and these 4 candidates each had different ways they felt that issue should be dealt with. These are the results of the election of 1860, and you can see from the numbers Abraham Lincoln was the winner, and he'll be the next president of the country. You should know, though, that in the South, they refused to put his name on the ballot. So even if you wanted to vote for him in the South, you couldn't have, although I'm sure nobody wanted to. But despite that, he was still able to garner enough votes to become the next president. Also be aware that during Lincoln's time, the president didn't take office until March. Nowadays, it's in January because they changed the law, but back then, the president didn't take office until March, so you had a big gap between the November election and then March when the new president would take office. Because of Lincoln's winning, the South felt that that would be the end of slavery in the South, because although Lincoln swore he would never abolish slavery in the South didn't believe him. So they felt that their only answer to Lincoln becoming president was to secede from the United States. South Carolina was the first state to do that. Make sure you make a note of that. South Carolina seceded on December 20th in 1860. And then within the next 6 weeks, 6 more states joined South Carolina. You had Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, and they're all indicated in the red on the map there. These new states, though, now decided how they were going to run things. So delegates from each of the southern states got together and held a constitutional convention. That was in Alabama in February of 1861, and they created the Confederate States of America, the CSA, rather than the USA. They wrote themselves a constitution, which mostly looked like the U.S. Constitution. It had the 3 branches of government. You had the executive branch with the president, the legislative branch with the Congress, and then you had a judicial branch. The South never really got their judicial branch up and running, though. Big differences, though, between the 2 constitutions are the Confederate States emphasized state rights, and they guaranteed the protection of slavery, so slavery was legalized under the CSA Constitution. They also chose their leaders, and Jefferson Davis was named president, and Alexander Stephens named vice president. Here are pictures of the 2. That's President Jefferson Davis and Vice President Alexander Stephens. Now what was happening in the South was the Confederate officials began seizing all the federally owned property. There were arsenals, there were military posts, there were post offices, courthouses. All these different buildings belonged to the United States of America. Well, the Confederate officials started taking over control of them and saying they now belong to us because they're located within the CSA. Fort Sumter is where the Civil War is going to begin. They show you a modern day picture of it. It's just a tiny little outpost out in the bay outside Charleston, South Carolina. And what the Confederacy did was they asked Lincoln to surrender the fort to them, and Lincoln refused. He had made a promise to the people in the United States that he would not surrender any of the military forts to the Confederacy. So now it's going to come to a head Lincoln refuses to surrender. The South wants to take over control. What's going to happen? This picture kind of answers that question. As you can see, Fort Sumter is going to be attacked, and you can see by the picture that they're not going to do too well in this attack. So the war is going to begin. Lincoln's decision to resupply Fort Sumter was a stroke of genius, historians believe. Fort Sumter was running out of supplies and they needed more supplies. And Lincoln, as I said, he refused to surrender the fort. He decided to send supply ships to give them the food and ammunition that they needed. Therefore, he was going to force the Confederacy to do something. They were either going to let the ship make it to the fort, or they would have to fire on the fort to stop it. So the South really began the battles of the Civil War, and this was the first one at Fort Sumter. Pierre Beauregard was in charge of the Confederate troops. On April 12th, he started firing on Sumter. Major Robert Anderson was the commander of Fort Sumter. In a little bit of irony, those two had both been at West Point together. Beauregard was a student and Anderson was his teacher. Well, what happened was Anderson ran out of ammunition and couldn't defend the fort any longer. So he was, after about 34 hours, he was forced to surrender Fort Sumter. And thus, this is the beginning of the Civil War. Lincoln started to ask for volunteers to build up an army. 4 more states decided to secede. You have Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. So now the CSA is made up of 11 states. And the Civil War has now begun.